You know Africa, right? Today, it's not exactly seen as the pinnacle of wealth, or food, or water in the modern world. But honestly guys, let's just get past that misconception. Today, there are many regions in Africa that are frankly doing quite well. The key word is many, because oh boy, there are some places that live up to that poor African stereotype. One place in particular famous for its pirates is Somalia. Somalia is poor, like really poor. By some measures, it is the poorest country on earth by per capita income. Not only that, there is civil war, instability, violence throughout the nation, destruction of entire towns with no one to rebuild them, and no government to keep it together. It's a libertarian and anarchist paradise. The Somalis are in many ways free to do whatever they want. It usually just means it ends up in violence, crime, fighting, and becoming modern day pirates. But that's just in the cities, right? Around 80% of the population lives in a nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle away from that, but also away from any economic prosperity. And this little section in the north has largely escaped the same fate as the rest of Somalia, unifying themselves into the de facto independent nation of Somaliland. How did they escape the hood? For the rest of the population, it's tough. Per capita income is around $870 with a 75% poverty rate and fairly high wealth inequality. How did Somalia end up in this position, and why did the North succeed? Somalia sits on the Horn of Africa. Look at it, it's so long and curvy, straddling the coast of the Indian Ocean. It sits at the cross-section of the Gulf of Aden and Indian Ocean, where the Red Sea spews outwards. This has always been a historically active trading area. You can trade to Africa, the Middle East, India, East Asia, and after the Suez Canal was blasted out, Europe too. Even today, roughly 30% of the world's traded goods flow through the Red Sea, having to pass by Somalia whenever it enters or exits. The Somalis have always been a seafaring and trading type people throughout history, and it's a main reason why when the state collapsed, many Somalis turned to piracy as a way to make money. But back to the land. Even though the Somalis have been defined by this water, their actual country doesn't have too much of it going around. In the south, sure, it's a little bit wet, but in northern Somaliland, it's incredibly dry. In the desert, which happens to cover most of the nation, the region receives 4 or less inches of rain annually. They do have 2 major rivers though, both controlled by Ethiopia, and much of the northern country is made up of mile-high plateaus which lack any rivers at all. This all means that agriculture is incredibly hard in a region with no water, so the Somalis never really developed it. Even modern-day Somalia, with all the fancy fertilizers and pesticides it can afford, only has 1.6% arable land, almost only in the south, so the majority simply just don't farm at all. Since they have never really developed agriculture, they never really developed cities or infrastructure to transport that agriculture. It led to most Somalis, especially in the olden day, living a nomadic lifestyle focusing on meat production. It also means that in modern day Somalia, the big cities have an over-reliance on imports, since they can't grow enough food for the 16 million people living there. How much bigger are their imports than exports? 2 times? 3 times? 5 times? Wrong! They import 22 times more amount of goods than they export. That is insane. Without the rest of the world, there would be even more chaos in the nation. And these exports are from their nomads, mainly sheep, goats, some gold, even insects. It gives you a sense about how they use their land. And that land did not bless the Somalis. Their most profitable practice was trading throughout history. But what was that Somali history like? Let's look at all of their ages. Pre-colonial, colonial, and then post-colonial Somalias to see how they developed into the poorest nation on the planet. The story of Somalia starts with a bunch of nomadic sheep herders, but that's way too far back, so let's skip ahead a little bit. People have lived there for a while, like the Macrobians, Barbara city-states, and even the Romans who used it as a trade outpost to reach the Spice Islands and India. Many traders would come to Somalia, like Indian and Middle Eastern, making it a pretty diverse society, at least on the coast. In the interior, it was still mostly herders. The Somalia we know started when Islam was introduced in the 600s by the very first wave of Muslims fleeing persecution in Arabia. Some of the oldest mosques in Africa are in Somalia. They have been here since Islam was a thing. Now was when the first real Somali kingdoms popped up, the Adal Sultanate in the north and the Ajuran Sultanate in the south, separated by wildly different geographies. They traded with everyone, selling luxury goods from India to East Asia to the Middle East, as trading for food wasn't really common until after World War II. It was in this time when Mogadishu became a thriving trading hub for the region. Textiles, spices, and luxury goods were traded out, and meat kept a decently sized population in the city. The Adjurans who hosted the city ended up lasting until the 1600s, when many different groups replaced them, like the Hirabs, Geleris, Majordines, and Hobios. And honestly, this was probably the last time Somalia had any legitimate economic influence over the rest of the world. Since then, they have more or less been in a decline. See, one of the main reasons Somalia shattered was because Somalia was not united at all. Well, ethnically it is pretty homogenous, but the real division in Somali society is through their clan system. The Somali people are split into 6 main clans: the Darod, Hawiye, Rawanyan, and Digil in the south, and Dur and Isaac clans in the north, now in Somaliland. These are the people who flock together as pastoral people, not as nationals of Somalia or the Adjuran Empire, but with your clan. And not only that, there are more divisions inside of these clans, the Dia paying groups. These are like sub-clans inside of the larger clan who had to pay diyas to other sub-clans. What's a diya? It translates literally to blood wealth. Basically, if somebody kills my son, that means somebody is getting killed. Or at least the other group will give you something like a couple of goats. And because resources were always so scarce in the region, these diya paying groups were always, and I mean always fighting with each other. You kill my guy, I kill yours. It was essentially countrywide gang wars for its whole history. Here's where also developed. Basically demands, rights, and duties that different diya paying groups had to give each other in exchange for wronging them. Because of these, political power in Somalia was never really centralized. Even the empires in the medieval days were more coastal city-states than actually controlling everyone in these clans. Somalia has still never developed a centralized state naturally. It has always needed some other power to pick up the fragmented pieces of the clans and force them together. The constant state of war and fighting and lack of one group getting powerful enough to take over the rest because they didn't have enough resources meant that there is no authority, which in turn meant there is no property rights, which meant there is no business or industry, which meant they were poor. Somalia was doomed even before any Europeans set foot in their country. The year is 1884 and Africa is getting so scrambled. In their drawing of the African map, the British got this part and the Italians got this part. They only needed to actually take it over. When they did get there, in order for the native Somalis to fight back, they would need to suddenly give up years of clan-based warfare fighting for their diyas and heers. That would be an absolute nightmare to coordinate. So the clans stayed fighting with each other while the Europeans moved in. There actually was a movement for an independent dervish state later in its history, but that was after the Europeans took over and it never garnered huge attention, having at max 6,000 soldiers. Now is the tale of the two modern Somalias, made by the British and Italianos. In the British half, where the dervish movement was most popular, they had a very hard time centralizing the region. They lost interest after the dervish war and ended up leaving it mostly to itself, severely underfunding this region which relies on imports, only really keeping it as a strategic location for global trade, which let the region fall back into clan-based warfare. The Italians were a tiny, eensy-weensy bit better. They had still failed to centralize the region and stop this clan-based warfare, but they did give it a little more development than the North. This Somalia focused on fish, meat, and pastures, mostly to feed its own population. The Italians did try to invest into banana and cotton plantations, but they failed. The market was too unstable, it was too competitive globally, and there were not enough Somalis to work. The two Somali states were more or less the same decentralized messes they were before colonization, just under a shiny European flag and in many instances neglected by their rulers. Then it changed after World War II. The country started actually paying attention to these colonies. The British had hired police to protect trade and people going into the interior of the nation and hired Kenyans to run the colony, which didn't help the locals, but by British Empire standards was pretty kind. In the south, the Italians spent a lot more effort educating children, getting teachers and bookkeepers in the country, sparking a business mini-revolution. There was a spike of peace and growth. Population doubled, literacy rate shot up to 40% from almost zero, and food security was becoming more and more stable. It was looking like Somalia would become a developed African country like South Africa or Morocco. Meanwhile, a new, educated middle class of Somalis who were getting experience of administration and economics started chatting amongst themselves, and they realized that it would be sick if the Europeans just left. And after the SNL, no, not that SNL, the Somali National League rose in popularity and the Europeans felt bad after World War II, the two nations voted to leave and merged into the now Somalia. There was actually a third Somalia I left out. We call it Djibouti today, and they voted to stay with France rather than join Somalia. I guess they must have been fortune tellers because that was certainly the right move on their part. They became over 5 times richer and are now living in a fairly stable state nowadays while the Somali state collapsed. So let's go to the now free Somalia to see how it collapsed. The Somali Republic was founded in 1960. Wait a second, there were 2 Somalias and now there's just one. Who's going to take over? Which region's president will be in charge? What languages will they use? Whose economic ideas will they use? What they decided was that all of it was too hard to integrate these 2 countries into each other. So they used the Italian Somali system with heavy autonomy given to Somaliland in the north. Southern guy Aden Ade was the first president and led over a fairly poor but potential heavy country. The north was a little worse as they lacked the capability to collect taxes from herders and farmers who comprised the bulk of the country, so little development was ever made. The country was not self-sufficient, relying on their old overlords to prop them up, with about a third of their budget coming directly from British and Italian aid, and after the Europeans left, the country struggled with centralization as clan wars raged up again. When the country couldn't support itself, those imports we saw earlier skyrocketed and never went down. From the instability, a new group which supported Siad Barre did a small coup and took over Somalia. With a little USSR aid, the new socialist nationalist government made a couple massive reforms. Firstly, was giving themselves a little paycheck for running the country and escaping the clan wars. Second, they increased spending into education, infrastructure, and literacy, probably the best thing they did. And third was to centralize the state under an authoritarian rule, nationalizing many industries, except for herding, which was upwards of 90% of the economy at the time, so that didn't do much. Still, the sudden centralization disrupted many traditional Somali lifestyles who frankly didn't have a real force of government in their lives for centuries. This, along with sudden industrialization in small sectors, made the people restless, and Barre used that unrest to carry out his fourth goal: reunite all the Somalis by invading Ethiopia. This was the point of no return in recent Somali history. Their fate was sealed. In the start of the war, it looked like they were actually winning, except there was no shot the Somalis could have won. Half of Ethiopia is densely populated mountains. Somalia, with only 3 million people at the time, could have never occupied the region they wanted without serious damage to their population. B, they had no money for a modern military, along with a huge drought that same year meant that they pretty much collapsed their entire industrial sector, something which might be useful in, you know, a war. And C, their good old friend the Soviets thought that this war was pointless, actually aiding Ethiopia against them. The country was in shambles after losing the war. They cut ties with the Soviets and became friends with the US for foreign aid. From economic issues, the government became increasingly authoritarian, which didn't bode well with the population, and dozens of militia groups who wanted to take control of the country popped up. You know, it was like a return to the casual sort of back-end clan war right now in the early 80s. But when food production was damaged and imports increased in price, making food unaffordable, the people went into full chaos mode. 1991 saw a race on who could collapse first, Somalia or the USSR, and Somalia won by 7 months. Shortages of food, water, fuel, medicine, and foreign currency meant that the state had nothing. It's like we're back to the resource-poor pre-colonial and colonial days, and the new clan war was soon to follow. By this time, Somaliland also got out as quickly as they could after a quick war, keeping some semblance of centralization and unity to the north. And after their short war in the 90s, Somalia got back together and everyone lived peaceful. No! The war lasted, who knows how many years the war lasted because it's still going on in 2022. Somalia is now the decentralized mess it has always been, with clans fighting over scarce resources just like the good old days. It also drove many young, ambitious, desperate Somalis to the life of the seas since life on land is not going anywhere. And in 2012, a federal government of Somalia was set up, still with almost no progress and no end in sight to the war. Somalia is a country that was cursed. They have always been decentralized historically because of the dry plateaus that make this land lack any sort of farming capability. Its roughly equally sized clans would fight over the scarce resources, with one clan never beating the rest, locking the area in a constant state of warfare. When the government suddenly forced the country to centralize and nationalize, the people who weren't used to that life went berserk, and ever since then, there has been no more government. This constant warfare and lack of authority to enforce property rights meant that the Somalis never developed a healthy, inclusive economy, a major reason why they are the poorest place on earth right now. The region which did have some semblance of centralization, Somaliland, ended up 3 times richer than the rest of the country. The Dias, Hears, and nomadic clan-based lifestyle all ruined Somalia, partly from their geography, partly from their history. Somalia might get better in the future if they can first sort out this 1500-year-old problem they still deal with today.